happy to be here this morning. The famous British parodist and comedian, some say was even Jewish, but that's, who knows. Max Beerbohm said that, in contrast to Santayana, history does not repeat itself, but historians repeat one another. So this morning we're going to explore that topic with regard to American Jewish history, and because we have four excellent speakers, and our time is always pressed, and I know that my colleagues are going to live within the 20-minute framework. I think because of the difference in topics, we'll take questions after each talk, which gives a 10-minute time for questions after each presentation, and therefore they won't make me into an evil human being by having to hand them notes. They'll end in 20 minutes. So we're going to begin with Dr. Pamela Nadel. Professor Nadel holds the Patrick Clenenden Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University in Washington, D.C., where she directs the Judaic Studies program. Her most recent book, co-edited with her colleague Kate Holman, is titled Making Women's Histories Beyond National Perspectives, which appeared in 2013. And among her many publications, she's so well known for her wonderful volume, Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of Women's English Service to Our Profession. And she is, as I hope most here know, currently the president of the Association of Jewish Studies in the United States and North America. So Dr. Nadel, if you please.
Thank you. Thanks, Gary. Hi, everybody. And I really did give him one sentence because I thought like there was no point in taking up time with that. So, there. Okay. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about what I'm going to call the American turn in modern Jewish history. And as you'll be able to see from this panel, that I put it together in a particular way because I really wanted us to think about this as a whole in terms of I'm going to talk about from what I see from the American side, and Gur is going to talk about what he sees from the Israeli side. Annie works on museums, and Shari comes from the next generation of scholars. And so this was really meant to be thought of as a kind of whole and see how the kind of conversation that evolves. So what I want to say is that until 1954, the writing of American Jewish history was largely what I would call filio-pietistic, as evidenced by the publications of the American Jewish Historical Society. And I recently wrote an article that actually, I think, literally appeared right before I came here for a column in the successor to this, which is now called American Jewish History, and it's a column called Sightings, and it asks us to go back and find a particular article in the journal that we think was path-breaking, and I was asked to find the first article about Jewish women, and I actually didn't find what I would call an article about Jewish women until 1976, but what I found in this journal, published since 1893, was lots of individual things about Jewish women, including an article from the early 19-teens that called the pioneering Jewish communal leader, Rebecca Gratz, and I will quote, one of the noblest specimens of the Jewish woman that this continent has ever produced. That article, by the way, did not say one single word about any of the organizations that this noble specimen had founded. So, and that article was published in the same decade that the American Jewish Historical Society's president was a man named Frederick Jackson Turner. So there's Gratz. But Turner, some of you might know, invented the frontier thesis, which continued to influence scholarship in American history like well into the 21st century. So it shows you what I mean by filio-pietistic, this kind of, celebratory scholarship on Jewish women. Not until 1954, during the celebrations marking the 300th anniversary of the American Jewish experience, were attempts made really to professionalize the writing of American Jewish history. And so the American Jewish Historical Society convened a famous conference called the Peekskill Conference on the status of the field. Moses Rishin, who was still then a graduate student, wrote a very influential pamphlet called Inventory of American Jewish History. I think I might have that, yeah. And you could actually go back to that now. You could read sentences, and if you know the field, you could see the books that those sentences sparked. The first Jewish communal urban histories were written. And so the field began to emerge in a serious way in academia. And in the 1960s, as scholars of American history began to turn to social history, American Jewish history began to come into its own as part of the new American social and ethnic history. So 2004 brought, so not so long ago, 13 years ago, brought an explosion of interest in American Jewish history. It was the 350th anniversary of the American Jewish experience. And although the field had grown substantially over the years, I see developments since 2004 as kind of taking it out in a much broader direction. So that even though survey courses in modern Jewish history, including the one that I have taught for decades and decades, typically pay almost no attention to the American Jewish experience. Usually American Jews get kind of two slots. They get the immigration moment, and then they usually get something after World War II, something about America and its dominance in the world. And I should say recent books, survey books of the Jewish experience, tend to do the same thing. I can point to one that says the U.S. appears on about 45 pages, but actually of those 45 pages, 35 pages have really nothing to do with U.S. Jews. They just happen to talk about America, and most of it's post-war. So, but the events that were planned around the 350th anniversary celebrations really, I think, led to some changes in the field that are poising it for this turn to the American turn in modern Jewish history. So I had to bring this, Gary. So Gary and I worked together on this extraordinary commission. Our job was to get American Jewish history recognized around the nation. Everybody's photographing this, you should know. You'll have to credit Getty Images. But let me give you what I mean by some of the signs of the explosion. That year, I gave, between 2004 and 2005, I gave 40 public lectures in American Jewish history. And Annie's nodding. I wasn't the only one. We were all on the road. We were spreading the word that American Jewish history had arrived. The Library of Congress mounted an extraordinary exhibition, From Haven to Home, 350 Years of Jewish Life in America. It was the best attended exhibition ever at the Library of Congress to that point in time. I don't know if the record still stands. I didn't call to find out. But it surely remains one of the best, if not the best, attended exhibition. The National Museum of American Jewish History, I hope a lot of you have been there, opened on Philadelphia's Independence Mall in 2010, but the project was well underway already in 2004, and I think the attention to the field helped pave the way for the fundraising and what happened, what was required to take see it through. Writing in the field since 2004. Oh, thanks. Right names? Yeah, you got me. What do you know? So, you may be familiar with something called the National Jewish Book Awards. So, writing in the field really, this is kind of an interesting way of looking at the field, because a number of books, the ones that are extended out, are on American Jewish history, and they won the big National Jewish Book Award of the year. And if you look at this carefully, you will see that if you look at the ones that are indented, you will see that the other big category that wins prizes for the book of the year, it relates to Israel. So writing in the field of modern Jewish history is either about, or in Jewish history, that wins these big prizes. I know the prize is given in America. I know there's going to be a bias towards America. Nevertheless, you will see that the writing is either about the two largest Jewish communities in the world. That seems to be where this kind of acclaim is centered. So, while I know that there are exceptions, this burst of scholarship in American Jewish history, I think, compels a revisioning and a reconsideration of the place of American Jewish history in the historiography of the modern Jewish experience. So that's the first reason for what I want to call the American turn. And the second reason that I perceive an American turn is the result of is a result of the embrace by American Jewish historians of what I want to call the transnational turn. Now, this you should be familiar with, the transnational turn in historiography. And if you're not, let me just say that influenced by forces of globalization, but actually having roots dating back to the 1960s, if not earlier, what we call the transnational turn in historiography seeks to explain cultural, economic, political, religious, social, institutional linkages across the national borders. And they enable us to make connections that we as historians who are so focused on the national might miss. So to give you an example, I will actually, of this transnational turn, I'll actually use my most recent book, Making Women's Histories Beyond National Perspectives, which I co-edited with a colleague of mine named Kate Hallman. Now, this book was a huge departure for me. This is a book, there's only one Jewish woman who appears in the book at all, and as you know, I write only about American Jews. I snuck her into the introduction. Instead, what this book shows, what it argues, is that it has essays on different time periods, different geographic locations, but about how women's history was being written in these different times and places, like Qing Dynasty China, colonial Egypt and India, Tsarist Russia, the U.S. roiling through the 1960s. And people ask questions there about the scholarship on women's history in these different settings. What the book shows is that no matter where, no matter when, and no matter who was doing the writing of women's history has always been a political project. It's been designed to improve the status of women in that particular time and place. So I could also point to other of my work in Jewish history in Jewish women's history that nods to the transnational turn. For example, I have a long piece, a research paper coming out in the new Ruderman series that Alroey edits, on how feminism emerged in the United States, and then in the 60s, the second wave of feminism, and then how its emergence influenced the development of feminism in Israel. But I'd like to, in the few minutes that I have left, I'd like to talk about some of the works that are really exemplary of the transnational turn. And here are just a couple of the titles. They ask different kinds of questions. How and why ideas and concepts crossed borders, or what is distinctive about American Jewry and American Jewish experience, but in the context of these ideas that are also being explored in other places. So, I'm going to mention a couple of examples, and you may be surprised by my first one. A particularly fine example of what I mean by transnational history is Ron Chernow's The Warburgs, the 20th century odyssey of a remarkable Jewish family. You might know Chernow far better because he's the author of the book called Hamilton that sparked a kind of mega Broadway hit. And actually now they reissued The Warburgs in an edition that says by the author of Hamilton. And we don't tend to think of Chernow as an American Jewish historian, but he's writing about this transnational Jewish family, and he's not the only one to do this. When you think about looking at Jewish history through a transnational lens, you get to very different questions. So when years and years ago, I wrote on Jewish immigration to America, the pattern of immigration, and for me, it started at point A somewhere in Russia, and it ended at Ellis Island. When Professor Alroey writes about Jewish immigration to America, it starts in many different places, it ends in many different places, and it leads to asking startling questions. He asks the question, can Aliyah only be to Israel? That's not a question that we could have thought of if we weren't thinking in transnational terms. The transnational turn compelled Rebecca Kobrin, you can see her book here, to revision the concept of homeland in Jewish Bialystok and its diaspora, looking at these Bialystoker diaspora communities scattered around the world. Same thing happens in Adam Mendelssohn's The Rag Race, where he takes an old question but comes up with a new answer. So the old question is, why do American Jews have such extraordinary economic success? His answer is, if you look at Jews who are in the garment trades in England, in the old clothes trade in England, and then you look at the same group of Jews, came from the same places, but they're in America and they're dealing with the rag trade. What happens? And so, why the different experience? And it's not that these Jews brought a particular set of tools in their cultural baggage. Rather, it's the context that they immigrated to and the changes in those contexts, the differences in those contexts that spark a particular kind of difference. So, so to bring it all together, I think modern Jewish historians, and I can't remember what else I had. Oh yeah, I have that word, Graham. Good. So, so Jewish historians, if you can kind of see what surfaces here. Digital history is kind of one of the other new terms today, but you see transnational kind of jumping out at you. So I think as American Jewish historians have embraced the transnational turn, modern Jewish historians who absolutely justifiably, in the age of Dubnov, in the age of Gratz, dismissed what they were writing about Rebecca Gratz in publications of American Jewish Historical Society, they weren't interested in the social history turn. Understand that, but it's not possible today to ignore the American experience in writing modern Jewish history. So I would argue, if it hasn't done so already, the American Jewish experience is poised to move from the periphery of the modern Jewish historical experience to its very center. Thank you.
Field your own questions?
I can field my questions. That's fine.
All right, so let's take about 10 minutes. If there are any questions, follow up here on Dr. Nadell's
and
lecture.
I'll just get out of that. And while I'm doing that, I'll get out of that.
Mira, you go right ahead.
Okay.
I would like to ask you, as you know, there are two main centers for writing Jewish history. Israel and the United States, or the opposite, should see. But I don't see that the writing on the American Jewish community, historically or even contemporarily, I don't see it in the center. I still think it's in the periphery.
That you still think it's in the periphery. Yeah. I think it takes a while to get it integrated. So that big history of the Jews that I'm thinking about, that I'm not going to talk about specifically, but it's clear that in that volume, which came out, it must have been in process, I think it came out maybe in 2013, must have been in process for a while, it's not fully incorporated. I don't think it's going to be possible, and I really want to hear what Professor Alroey says, I don't think it's going to be possible to continue to ignore the American Jewish experience in the writing of the modern Jewish experience, because I don't think you can ignore the kinds of books that I just put up as examples. But again, I think we're in the middle of seeing that turn, and I don't think that it's fully realized yet. So there, I very much agree with you, Mira. Yeah. Others. Yeah. Can you identify yourself? I'm sorry, I don't. Oh, Adam, hi. I know your work.
Thank you. It's really interesting, and yeah, I think a lot about these same issues, and this is a great opportunity. So when transnational, the way I understood it from you, implies that it's sort of an integrative type of approach rather than a contrasting approach. It's sort of almost like a globalized sort of understanding of Jewish history. And I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit, because I'm absolutely sure that comparisons or contrasting different communities is a very effective way to try to understand what's unique about one, or et cetera, et cetera. It's not clear to me yet when that word transnational implies something that comes together, and how does that come together?
So I agree with you. It's not comparative history. Comparative history is very difficult to do well. The scholar I think who does that best is probably Deborah Cohn, who wrote about soldiers after World War I in Germany and in Great Britain and the different trajectories of their experiences based on the different contexts. Because this is much more thematic than comparative. So it is asking a big question across time. So the best example I can give is I'll refer to my own work because it's what I know. Is when I wrote Women Who Would Be Rabbis, I wrote about Regina Jonas as the first woman who was ordained, and in that book, she is really kind of on the periphery. Her story enters chronologically where it belongs, but I don't really understand how she fits into a worldwide movement of questions about women's religious leadership. When that book came out, I was on a panel at the American Academy of Religion with a scholar who had written on female evangelical preachers in the 18th and early 19th century, and two scholars who had written on American Catholic nuns. And our books had come out at exactly the same time, but we hadn't been in conversation with each other because we didn't understand that we were essentially asking the same question about the emergence of women's religious leadership. And we weren't yet in conversation with scholars in Germany who since then have recovered Jonas and so much more about her and thrown that discussion over across the Atlantic. So I do think that it is much more about an inclusive kind of picture. It's a question, and then how do we answer it from different places? Okay? Ronnie, hi.
Thanks for those remarks. When I think about transnational also in the American historiographic tradition, I sort of think about decentering American exceptionalism. That was part of the project.
Yeah.
So I wonder, I'm trained as an Americanist, not as a Jewish studies scholar. So I'm wondering if there's maybe a need to decenter something, to do something similar in Jewish history, and maybe that's partly why American Jewish history has remained on the periphery, because there needs to be, I'm not familiar with scholarship, but some part of the project is decentering the exceptionalism of, in the case of the U.S., or maybe the exceptionalism of the European experience or the Israeli experience. I don't know.
Right, and it might be more that it's more about decentering the exceptionalism of the European experience, because like Mira's comment, Mira said, where are the two great centers in writing of Jewish history today? And Mira left Europe out of the picture entirely, and I don't think my colleague Michael Brenner would be so happy because he's a Ludwig Maximilian. But it may be more about, the European experience was really paradigmatic. When I teach that modern Jewish civ course, which I learned how to teach many, many decades ago and have not changed enough, there's like this huge unit on 1789 to 1914, and it's like all in Europe except for the immigration experience in America. Yeah. Good. Others?
Which also ignores all of North Africa and
and South Africa, obviously. Right. And that's, this is...
to the point of, I'm sure it's maybe sort of relates to what Paul was speaking, it just says, there is such this effort now to get the history of Jews from Muslim countries into Jewish history.
Right.
It's similarly happening. If you talk about transnational and thematic problems in historiography, I very much see the parallels of getting American history into these intro courses, just as the history of Jews from Muslim, they aren't
Right.
identical, but a similar kind of question and problem.
Yeah.
I
Mayor.
think I wasn't understood. I meant that the researchers
Oh,
are in America and here. I'm sorry, there are also many in Europe.
There are also many in Europe. Yeah. Okay. Shari.
There already are some sort of modern Jewish historians who are including America, even if it's just in the epilogue, right?
Right.
And I think that is also part of this turn. It is starting to happen little by little. So I'm wondering if you think that those people need is your attitude sort of like, come on board, write about America, or do you think they need some special training or sort of do they need to be steeped in the literature, or is that a concern for you as this sort of moves forward?
I don't know that I would suggest some special training, but I think that the examples of the books I put up, those books are too significant to be ignored, and also only to be read by people who are working in the U.S., and I think that they're spilling over. Or at least maybe I'm being Pollyannish, and I'm hoping they're spilling over. Okay? How are we doing on time? Okay?
A minute or two.
Minute. One more, maybe? No? All right, thank you.
פאם, thank you. אומר שאם אני הייתי יכול להציג בפנינו את פרופסור אלרואי בלשון הקודש, אבל אני שמעתי שהוא ידבר באנגלית, אז לא נסבל עם העברית העלובה שלי, and we'll switch to English. So it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Alroey, who is the department chair of Israeli Studies and the chair of the Ruderman Program for American Jewish Studies at the University of Haifa. Professor Alroey published 5 books on Jewish migration, as we've heard, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and on the territorial ideology. He's also published many articles in leading journals of the field dealing with various aspects of his research interests. His new book, Zionism Without Zion, the Jewish Territorialism Organization, the JTO, ITO, and the Zionist movement, was recently published by Wayne State University Press. He's going to speak to us, as Dr. Nadell already indicated, on Israeli historiography and American Jewry, the current state of research. Professor Alroey.
תודה. On Rosh Hashanah Eve in 1969, 3 volumes set on the history of Jewish people from biblical times to the mid-20th century was published in Israel. In the foreword, the editor, Chaim Hillel Ben Sasson, wrote that, I quote, "The work offered here to readers is the joint enterprise of number of historians. Despite the differences in their fundamental historical outlooks and research approach, the different sections merge into a continuous view of the history of Israel from the beginning to the present day." End of quote. For a generation, these volumes were most important textbooks on the subject for Israeli universities and high schools. They sketch the lineament of the long history of Jewish people, highlighted key events of the process in its life, and serve as a roadmap for understanding the annals of the Jews in different periods and on different continents. The volume on the modern age was written by Professor Shmuel Ettinger of the Hebrew University, one of the country's leading historians at the time. It began with the Jews' migration and economic activity in the 70s and the 18th centuries, and conclude with the establishment of the State of Israel and the challenges it faced in its first 2 decades. The focus is Europe, Western and Eastern. Only a few pages are dedicated to the Jews of the United States. In his immensely influential book, Ettinger almost totally ignored the largest Jewish community in the world. In this, he faithfully reflected the attitude of Israeli academia and historians about American Jewry. These attitudes were deep-rooted decades before Ettinger. The historians and bibliographer Getzel Kressel noted that the Israeli research into the Jews of the United States was sparse and inadequate. It was, I quote, difficult to say that in the recent talk about American Jewry, and even more so in journalistic writing, one can find some background knowledge, even limited, about this diaspora community. Our widespread ignorance about everything associated with American Jewry and its history is unforgivable, given that the community has played such a decisive role in these decisive years for us, such that we must not ignore it. In my paper, I examine Israeli historiography, treatment, American Jewry, and try to understand why Israeli historians born and educated in Israel hardly studied the American Jewish community until the 1990s and early years of the current century. Why was American Jewry, of all the Jewish diasporas, the least studied in Israel and with such a delay. I will focus not only on Israel-born historians who wrote about American Jewry, but also on American Jewish scholars who moved from the United States to Israel and took up position in Israeli academia. The members of the latter group published in Hebrew and left their remark on the studies of American Jewry in Israel. Another body of research about American Jewry published in Israel, which I will refer to, are the Hebrew translations of works by leading American scholars. This body of translated materials, as we shall see, changed the field beyond recognition and made it possible for educated Hebrew readers to learn about Jewish community in North America. Shimon Alkin's short monograph, Jews and Judaism in America, יהודים ויהדות באמריקה, was the first book on the topic ever published in Hebrew in 1946. The book reflected the public discourse about American Jewry in the pre-state Yishuv. It was mainly a critical analysis that was deeply rooted in the rejection of the exile and called for all Jews to make Aliyah. Alkin's book was judgmental, as was appropriate for the Jews living in Palestine, Israel in those years. In 1956, Alexander Manor translated historian and sociologist Bezalel Sherman's Jews and Other Ethnic Groups in the United States from Yiddish into Hebrew. In contrast to Alkin's negative approach, Sherman presented an up-to-date picture of the Jews in America and avoided judging them. He presented sociological and demographic aspects of American Jewry and its tie with other ethnic groups in the United States. Manor translation was published by Am Oved with the explicit goal of laying the foundation for serious debate in Israel about Jewish life outside Israel in general and in the United States in particular. The motivation for the translation into Hebrew was to give Israelis a closer look at American Jewry and understand it better. A turning point of American Jewry in Israel was the establishment of the Institute of Contemporary Jewry in 1959 and the series of publications on the history of American Jews initiated by Moshe Davis. Davis was the first American to earn doctorate at Hebrew University on a Jewish American topic. In 1959, Davis' doctoral dissertation was published as a book entitled היהדות, אמריקה בהתפתחותה, and in 1953 he published his second book, דרכי היהדות באמריקה, which was standard text in Israel. This was no longer a random translation of books, but a series with its own rationale, whose volumes were linked and complementary. According to Davis, the Hebrew language series of studies of American Jewish community was intended to satisfy the increasing need for books on the topic, a need that has been felt in the past, especially in teaching at the university and other institutions of higher education in Israel in its diaspora. Over the decades, the series produced a long line of studies of American Jewry in Hebrew. This includes Moshe Davis, בית ישראל באמריקה, בנימין קורן, הקיבוץ היהודי באמריקה בשנות התעצמותו, ג'ייקוב מרקוס, מבוא לתולדות יהדות אמריקה בתקופה הראשונה, סלו ברון, Trial of Freedom Chapter in American Jewish History, Eli Ginsberg, The Jews, יהודי אמריקה, קהילה חופשית בהתהוותה, אברהם קאפ, חיי הרוח של יהדות אמריקה, מנחם קאופמן, non-Zionist in America and the struggle for Jewish statehood, 1984. All the translated books were written by leading Jewish American historians, and the purpose of this series was to expose the Israeli leader to the history of Jewish life in America. To these studies, most of them published in the 70s, we should add others that were not part of the series initiated by Davis. For example, Eviatar Frizel, the Zionist movement in the United States, the first of many American Zionism studies that will be published later, Marshall's Clark, The Jews of the United States, 1972, and the volume of translated article, The Jewish Mass Migration to the United States and the Growth of American Jewry, edited by Arthur Gowen and Yosef Vankrat. After Tel Aviv University was founded in 1969, its faculty in the early 1970s included American Jewish historians who had made Aliyah and taught American Jewish history. Along with the Institute of Contemporary Jewry in Jerusalem, new faculty positions in American Jewish history were added. So an increasing number of Israeli university students were exposed to American Jewry. Robert Rokossovsky and Aryeh Gardner, who taught in Tel Aviv, initiated a program in American Jewish studies and published some of their work in Hebrew. Aryeh Gardner, his book in, I think, 1980s, היישוב היהודי בארצות הברית מראשיתו עד ימינו, רוברט רוקווי, מהגרים, פועלים וגנגסטרים, הגנגסטר היהודי בארצות הברית. The two scholars taught hundreds of students and served as an advisor of scores of thesis and dissertation, but when they retired in the 1990s, there was no one to take their place in Tel Aviv University, and American Jewish studies almost totally vanished from Tel Aviv University. The first volumes of Davis series and books issued by other publishers dealt with various aspects of American Jewry. By contrast, the works of Israeli scholars who were exposed to American Jewry at Tel Aviv University or in Jerusalem focus almost exclusively on the Zionist movement in America and the link between American Jewry and Israel. Almost nothing was written about historical issues specific to American Jews that had nothing to do with Israel or Zionism. Jews, for example, Jews in the colonial era and during the Civil War, the mass immigration of the late 19th century and early 20th century, relation between Jews and African American civil rights movement, and the growth of the different religious streams, and many others. The works written in the 1990s and thereafter demonstrate the increasing interest of the Zionist movement in the United States and its contribution to the Yishuv and later to Israel. Mira Katzburg-Jungmann dissertation 1994 dealt with the ideology and activity of Hadassah Women Organization 1948 and 1956, and later expanded version American Women Zionist Hadassah and the Rebirth of Israel, אלון גל, ישראל הנחשפת, ספר edited book, זוהר סגב, מפוליטיקאים אתניים למנהיגים לאומיים, עופר שיף, about אבא הלל סילבר and the reform ideology, and all these works examine how the Zionist movement made its way in American society and shed new light on the link between American Jewry and the issue of the Zionist movement and the state of Israel. In addition to the studies of Zionism in the United States, few works were published about American Jewish topics unrelated to Zionism. In America, it's Jews and the Rise of Nazism, 2000s, Hebrew translation 2006, Guli Ne'eman Arad wrote about the encounter between American Jews and Nazism and how, if at all, the Jewish leadership in the United States assisted the Jewish communities in Europe in the 1930s. In his socio-demographic studies of American Jews, migration, community, and identification Jews in the late 20th century America, 2001, a revision of his dissertation, Uzi Rebon examined the correlation between changes in residential patterns and the link to Jewish identity and culture. Kimi Kaplan wrote or a series of works about the period of mass Jewish migration to the United States, 1881, 1924, written originally in Hebrew, made a contribution to understanding the Jewish immigrant society in the United States. We can only regret that these works have not yet been translated into English because they enrich the broad scholarly literature that deals with the great Jewish migration of the early 20th century. Kimi Kaplan wrote about the lives and ceremonies of Orthodox rabbis who immigrated to America from Eastern Europe, אורתודוקסיה בעולם החדש. אלי לדר הנדלר Migration to the West and the New World 2006 was a course book for the Open University. And myself, The Quiet Revolution, I reviewed the problem faced the immigrants from the moment they decided to leave home until they reached the port in Ellis Island and other port in the country of destination. Ehud Manor published the foreword, the Jewish daily newspaper. Hagit Cohen very recently published the נפלאות בעולם החדש, the In Wonders in the New World, Yiddish books and readers in the United States. Hagit Cohen traces how Yiddish literature molded the American identity and the Jewish immigrant to the United States. This is the first work in English or Hebrew that studies the Yiddish books market in the United States and with the culture of Jews in America. In 1992, Jonathan Sarna and Lord Garter published the Jews of the United States collection, this book of 19 articles by a senior American Jewish historian, including Jacob Marcos, Arkadiusz Kahn, Deborah Dwor, Paula Hyman, Ben Halpern, Henry Feingold, and Marshall Sklar. The translation of Arthur Herzberg, The Jews, this one, The Jews in America, 4th Century of an Uneasy and Contemporary History, in 1989, published in Israel in 1994, was the first systematic survey available to Hebrew readers of the Jews in the United States from the colonial period to the Kennedy administration. Jonathan Sarna, American Judaism, appeared in Hebrew in 2005, and in 2016, Hebrew edition of Jonathan Sarna and Benjamin Chappell, Lincoln and the Jews, was the first work available in Hebrew about American Jews during the Civil War. The Ruderman program at the University of Haifa recently initiated a project to translate current studies in Hebrew, like Moshe Davis project in the 1970s. And we're trying to enrich the Hebrew language literature on American Jews. 3 volumes have appeared to date. Hasia Diner, The Jews of the United States, 1654 to 2000, published here in Israel in 2015. Abraham Kahn, 1917 novel, The Rise of David Levinsky, is the first of Kahn works to be translated into Hebrew. The third publication is Gal Beckerman's book, When They Come From Us, We Will Be Gone. And the fourth scheduled for 2018, the Irving Howe 1976 classic, The World of Our Father. This historiographical survey leads to the question of why Israeli scholars devoted so little attention to American Jewry until the 1990s. Why was most of the research about American Jewry translated from English rather than original products of Israeli academia? So I have maybe 3 or 4 reasons. First, in the 50s and the 60s, the Israeli disdain for American Jewry. There is a direct link between the critical and sometimes negative public discourse in Israel of the 1950s and the 60s about American Jewry and the absence of original Israeli research about American Jewish community. The core of the public discourse about American Jewry was the rejection of the exile and the demand that all Jews immigrate to Israel. no arguments were heard in favor of the legitimacy of Jewish life in North America. In this negative atmosphere, scholarly research about American Jewry seen as threatening the Zionist ethos because it posed an alternative form of Jewish existence outside Israel. The second is the Israeli universities. The studies of American Jewry began in Israel University in 1959, as I mentioned, with the Institute of Contemporary Jewry, with the establishment of the Institute of Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University. Until then, the American Jewish community was not recognized object of study in Israel, but not only in Israel, but I understand from your lecture, Pam, that also in the United States. Before the Institute was established, the senior faculty member in the Department of Jewish History at the Hebrew U were First Temple period, Benjamin Mazar, Avraham Malmat, Hanoch Reviv, Second Temple period, Shmuel Safrai and Menachem Stern, Middle Ages, Yitzhak Ber, Chaim Beinart and Chaim Hillel Ben Sasson, and Modern Age, Ben Zion Dinur, Israel Alperin, Shmuel Entiger, Uriel Tar, and all of the modernists studied the Jews of Europe. In his memoir, Davis recounted that he was astonished to discover the extent of Israeli society ignorance of American Jewry. I quote, "In Israel, the million of Jews in the United States and the rest of North America were not considered worthy of interest. In a book about important Jews of recent generation, the only one deemed worthy of mention was Henrietta Salt. Yehuda Leib Magnus, Stefan Weiss, Abba Hillel Siever, Mordechai Kaplan, and other giants of thought and need from the United States were not mentioned at all. When Ben-Gurion received an honorary doctorate from Brandeis University, Davis was astonished to receive a telephone call from an editor of an Israeli newspaper who wanted information about who is Louis Brandeis and the university named for him. And the last reason, of course, is the American Jewry, a new field of academic study. There was, quite simply, the field had not yet matured in the United States. It is true that Salo Baron and Jacob Marcos had thought about American Jewry long before then, but it was only in the 1970s that the course offering expanded significantly. Some of the students who enrolled in them went to make American Jewry their field of scholarships. It goes without saying that if an American Jewish history was not recognized discipline in the United States before the 1960s and the 1970s, in Israel the field was quite undeveloped. Aside from Moshe Davis, who was not born and educated in Israel, but he got in PG in Jerusalem, there was no one in Israel who dealt with the post-World War II contemporary Western diasporas. This historiographical survey indicates that Israel now has a good research infrastructure, both original writing and translated works. For the studies of American Jewry, we can hope that the new students and scholars will continue to investigate the history of American Jewry in the future and develop this discipline in Israeli academy. Thank you. Yeah.
A couple of comments, if I may. A story that I heard here years ago was that when Salo Baron was on sabbatical in Israel, and they wanted to give him a course to teach. They didn't trust him in those areas in which he had written, and he gave what may have been the first course in American Jewish history at the Hebrew University.
In what year?
I don't remember the year. Secondly, I think it's interesting that Ahad Ha'am was interested in American Jewish history, to the point that when a classical reform rabbi by the name of Max Raisin offered to write articles on the history of American Jewry, he was able to publish them in Hashiloach, the prestigious journal of Ahad Ha'am, already at the beginning of the 20th century. And finally, if you want to see the difference in attitude toward American Jewry, I think it becomes visually clear if you compare Beit HaTfutzot in its initial version, where it culminated in an upward slope of Aliyah to Israel, and America was very much neglected, and the current version, which has been curated by a Reform woman rabbi, an Israeli Reform woman rabbi, which gives much attention to American Jewish history and to the American Jewish scene today.
I'd be interested in hearing perhaps both of you, where you would see something like Moshe Davis's project of America in the Holy Land. Because on the one hand, it's Israel focused, but not only Jewish, and it's not only Zionist, but it's Holy Land, and, you know, trying to get the field of the connection between the two, which is sort of not one and not the other, and not only Jewish.
I'm not sure that I understood the question.
How do you see Moshe Davis's project of America and the Holy Land and all the books that were republished within this, the framework of what you were talking about?
I think, I'm not sure that this project was published.
It reprinted many
Papers.
books that were published, I think all by Americans. I'm not quite sure, I don't quite remember, you know, relating to Israel.
What I remember, I actually went to one of those conferences. I was like just starting my career, and there must have been one in Washington. What I seem to remember was that and I could be totally wrong because I don't know what was published, but that they were only interested in the ways in which Holy Land issues or shlichim or something like that showed up in America. So they were only interested, Annie, am I right? They were only interested in the connections between America and the issue.
Yeah, and
Is that right?
No, because what
Yeah,
what
because-
I know is basically, you know, reprinting of books that have.
Yeah, the main goal of the translation project was to educate the Israelis about American Jewry. So the Eretz HaKodesh was completely different goal. The series of translation, the main goal is for the Israeli readers, just to learn more about American Jewry.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to add 3 people that sort of as you made that
Okay.
wonderful list. Charles Liebman, Daniel Elazar, Solomon Pohl. And what I think have in common is they were Americans who made Aliyah, and they also were social scientists, not historians.
Yeah.
So I was wondering about whether you have any thoughts about it. It seems to me that Israeli social scientists, or Olim and Israeli social scientists, sort of discovered America way before the historians.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on why that would be.
Look, Bezalel Sherman was a sociologist, was not an historian, and in my studies I focus only on historians, both Israelis or Jews who made Aliyah and came to Israel. I didn't check all publication in Hebrew about American Jewry. Also, you know, I focus only on books and not articles and other publications. So I have to say I'm not familiar with all the materials of sociologists and social scientists that publish in Hebrew about American Jewry, and I focus only on historians. And so I don't know to tell you the years and the reasons why they publish or translated their studies in Israel in specific year. This was my service was on focused only on historians.
I think that really supports your last answer, which is that the field of American Jewish history is a relatively young field, even in America, and even the idea that American Jewish intellectual history is of a stature that it has to be spoken of in the context of broader intellectual themes is relatively at a somewhat of an early stage in its maturity. So in that way, that would make sense that the Israeli scholars were even later than the Americans themselves in discovering themselves. So to speak. Yeah.
Thank you for this. Your survey brings out very clearly the question of the politics of translation, because there are people making decisions both on the let's say the academic merit of the book, the salability of the book. There are all kinds of things going together to create translations from English, and in the one case early on from Yiddish. So what needs to be looked at very clearly is who are the people who are making the decisions and how, between the scholars and the presses.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I have to find not the archives, but the documents of the in the Institute of Contemporary Jewry about the rationale and why Davis decided to translate this book and not other. But if we take the books that Davis decided to translate, we can say that he chose the best historians or the best monograph in that time. So it's always, or there is always politics, especially in the academia and the Israeli academia. But in the case of Davis, maybe there was a politics, maybe not. I don't know. But the books that were translated into Hebrew were in that time were written by leading historians. So I can't tell you, what was the politics and why Davis made the decision, that book or other one. It looks for me that in the 60s, in the 70s, the books he chose were to translate were a good decision. Eli?
Yeah, I think maybe to just broaden the perspective a little bit, it's important to understand that American history is not developed in Israeli university life. You could count the American historians working in Israeli universities on one hand. Now, to ask for American Jewish history to be a highly developed field is already, a bit of chutzpah. So, the point is, I think, the larger point is that the major intellectual and academic scientific engagement of the Israeli academic establishment from the 1920s on has been either in Middle Eastern studies or in European studies. Those are the two major building blocks of academic work in Israel. All of the rest is all of the rest. And with all due respect, we have, 3,000 years, some odd, of engagements with other cultures in other parts of the world. And what have we got to work with in our field? We have 10% of that. So it's, plus the fact that, as you pointed out, there's an institutional process that's been slowly taking place, and it's, in line perhaps with what Pam was saying about how it took an enormous amount of work for the American Jewish historiographical enterprise to gain traction. So I think, we can be a little bit modest, we can understand our place in the world, and still to have aspirations to grow.
Yeah, but when I checked the syllabus in the Hebrew U in the 60s and in Tel Aviv University in the 70s, there were courses about American Jewry, and mainly on Jewish migration. Ettinger in the Hebrew University taught a course about Jewish migration, and Moshe Mishkinsky taught a course about Jewish migration in Tel Aviv. But it's very interesting that there were no students, to write or thesis and dissertation about the migration. I agree that the American history in general, even today in the Israel Academy, is something that's barely found in Israel.
I would take one more question. I see your hand's been up a long time, and then we'll go on. Okay. All right.
Just, summary done, one of the interesting things I've done in my research is that I found in the files in the Foreign Ministry, especially involved with Esther Hurlitz in 1954, there were a number of Esther Hurlitz who passed away working with them. In 1954, Jews in the United States found money. They set up money to set up in this university a department, and also to fund for 7 years research into American Jewry, and the Senate refused to accept the money. I think that says, maybe the Germanic part of it maybe, but that's important. And the other thing, just to add to Eli, about various area studies, is only in the last 15, 20 years that Israel, I know it seems ridiculous, that our students in Israel are learning about Israeli history. And I think that therefore, as Eli said, there's a context here, but the main point is that people didn't want our students to learn about American history. If you looked at, and I always advise everyone, if you want to know what the policy is, go to the examination questions of matriculation. And if you go there and you look at the question, because there was always on American Jewry, the point was there was nothing about pluralism. We don't even have a word for Hebrew in pluralism. And the end message was, how come the Jews have found different ways of being Jewish in the United States? And that was one of the reasons why they didn't want to set up studies here at this university.
Well, I think we have to bring this to an end. I'm sorry to be the shoter, but I know we want to thank Professor Alroey one more time. On the frontier, religion and mobility in the 19th century. She'll be speaking today on American Jewish history and the question of disciplinarity.
Hi everybody, hello. It's really great to see so many people, and I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm delighted for the conversation to follow. So the study of American Jews has largely been undertaken as a historical project. In some ways, this is not a surprise, given the long-standing prominence of memory in American Jewish culture. As Beth Wenger has shown, history has long excited Jews as a means of crafting identity and laying claim to the American project. The creation of the American Jewish Historical Society in 1892, along with its journal the next year, as we've heard, followed in 1947 by the American Jewish Archives, created a healthy infrastructure for the historical study of American Jews. Use of these materials was further encouraged by the explosion of interest in social history in the 1970s, immigration, ethnic, and urban history, in which American Jews proved a relatively easy fit. It was in this era that a field called American Jewish history became a serious field of academic inquiry, a status that it enjoys to this day. And yet, a search through the archives of the Academic Jobs Wiki, an aggregate of job listings obsessively checked and updated by unemployed scholars, shows that since 2013, positions for scholars working on American Jews have been listed under at least 7 different titles. In fact, only one position even included the phrase American Jewish history, and it was described as a job in modern Judaic studies with a preference for American Jewish history and culture broadly defined. How broad remains unclear, and yet this formulaic uncertainty bespeaks a growing challenge to the traditional modes and topics of this area of study, I want to argue. Indeed, embedded in the various job descriptions are important questions about what it is that we study when we study American Jews. For instance, ads refer to American Jewish culture and society, modern Judaism in the Americas, and somewhat awkwardly combining these two approaches, American Jewish religious cultures, notably in the postmodern plural. Also contested is the geographic frame. Most refer to the adjective American, but we also get the Americas, the North American Jewish experience, here in the singular, and American Jews as a subset of a temporally defined modern Judaism or modern Judaic studies. Also uncertain here is the expected methodological approach. Most straightforward is the one job in American Jewish literature, good for them. But notably, the most popular formulation, appearing 3 times, is the much more vague American Jewish Studies. These job listings are admittedly the product of committee members in other fields, and yet they're an important place for thinking about the field of American Jewish history, as this panel has termed it. On the one hand, they demonstrate its growth at a time of academic crisis, and I think a little bit of the last conversation was kind of about the crisis in the humanities, which apparently is not contained to America. Designated positions for scholars of American Jews seem to be on the rise, an indication of public interest in the field. Indeed, quite a few of these positions are endowed chairs, which means the communities want them. My own job at the College of Charleston was advertised in Jewish Studies with an expectation to lead the newly endowed Pearlstein-Libov Center for Southern Jewish Culture, whatever we take that to mean. Questions of political economy and academic bureaucracy aside, however, I'm interested here in what we take to be American Jewish Studies and the nature of its implications for our intellectual life as scholars of American Jews. On some level, the field has always been American Jewish Studies, multidisciplinary before it was cool. Beginning in 1978, so right when it was sort of relaunched, the journal American Jewish History published American Jewish Studies, a periodic report of the state of the field, which described relevant conferences, courses, and dissertation projects carried out in a range of fields and disciplines. A quick Google Scholar search indicates that the term American Jewish Studies has largely been used by those pushing its boundaries, Latin Americanists, specialists in music and literature, and sociologists. And indeed, if Jewish communal interests on some level fueled the study of American Jewish history as an adjunct to the project of memory, it also fueled the social scientific study of American Jews. Sociology especially offered tools for explaining Jewishness to fellow Americans and for surveying American Jews in the aid of communal self-understanding. These developments of the field of American Jewish history and American Jewish Studies sort of 1.0 coincided with the rise of Jewish studies in academia more generally, although it too tended to favor historical approaches, and as we've discussed, it marginalized the study of American Jews as insufficiently important or serious, right? You didn't need knowledge of 1 million languages to study it, so it was sort of less important. And yet the rising number of jobs in American Jewish history indicate the field's maturity. The early pioneers in academic American Jewish history have trained several generations of students, and there has been, according to my own late teacher, Paula Hyman, a normalization of American Jewish history. So where are we now? How are scholars studying American Jews? Is American Jewish Studies a better framework, and what are its possibilities? In order to further explore the state of the field, I'm going to describe my own new project, brand new. You're the first crowd I'm talking to about it. And I'm going to talk about the sort of work that is inspiring that project and how it builds on different disciplinary approaches to the study of American Jews. So we're going to stay Southern. Feels strange to talk about the South here, but we're going to do it. The Goldring-Woldenberg Institute for Southern Jewish Life was founded in Jackson, Mississippi in 2000, but it traces its roots to the 1986 founding of the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience. As its website explains, it, quote, was formed as a response to an outcry from small-town Southern Jews in need of a repository for artifacts, sacred objects, historical documents, and stories. By 1986, the post-agrarian New South was on the rise, fueled by the development of major southern metropolises like Atlanta and Charlotte. Even so, the region's histories of racial segregation and evangelical faith continued to make their marks. Meanwhile, the American Jewish community had become more and more organized around Israel politics, the memory of the Holocaust, and concern about Jewish continuity in the face of intermarriage and disaffiliation. This is a very rough sketch, right? The history of the 1980s is still yet to be really grappled with fully, but there's my best shot on one foot. It was in this context that the museum first and then the institute worked to collect and in fact to rescue the material culture of Southern Jews, preserving small-town synagogues and cemeteries and collecting unused Judaica from these communities that had disappeared. And yet, as the Institute website puts it, quote, the story of Southern Jewish life is also a story of growing communities, vibrant congregations, and active Jewish communities of all sizes. The Institute and its charismatic founder, Macy D. Hart, sought to celebrate and revive what he calls the Southern Jewish experience. They have designed a Hebrew school curriculum for small communities that don't have professional educators, employed circuit-riding rabbis to provide services throughout the region, and brought dozens of young Jews to the South to work as interns and fellows. Along the way, the ISJL has attracted considerable attention, raising millions of dollars, and attracting national recognition as an innovative Jewish organization. My project will be the first academic study of the museum and the Institute, and in many ways it will be the history of an institution with traditional historiographical interventions to make. Scholars have long debated the existence and extent of Southern Jewish regionalism and have pointed to the importance of heritage and historical memory among American Jews. If regionalism is questionable as a rubric for explaining Jewish life, however, it certainly is real in the forms of identity and history constructed at the Institute, which itself indicates the multifaceted and multilocal nature of American Jewish heritage. So I'm interested here in what happens when sort of Jewish memory and Southern heritage come together. The ISJL is a case study of American Jewish heritage and memory in its under-recognized Southern iteration during a time of shifting identity politics and communal anxieties. So my interest in this project began during a trip to Natchez, Mississippi for the Southern Jewish Historical Society meeting last year, but it's further animated by recent multidisciplinary scholarship on American Jews, their institutions, and their approaches to memory. First of all, I think it's fair to say that in recent years and in conversation with new work in American Jewish history more broadly, there have been not only studies that focus directly on identity categories like race, class, gender, and ethnicity, but also studies that emphasize the structural forces that shape these categories. Indicative of this tendency are important edited volumes like, as already mentioned, Kahn and Mendelssohn's Transnational Traditions, and also Rebecca Coburn's Chosen Capital, The Jewish Encounter with American Capitalism. In the first case, American Jewish history becomes transnational, an early example of contemporary global migration. In the second, American Jews helped produce capitalism, a historical formation which has come under increasing scrutiny in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis. So just as globalization has led to transnationalism, the global financial crisis has led to increased attention to the history of capitalism. At the same time, renewed interest in migration and state regulation have fueled important contributions by Libby Garland in her book on Jewish illegal immigration, and by Britt Tevis and Geraldine Gudefen in their recent dissertations on Jewish immigrants and the U.S. legal system. Meanwhile, Deborah Dashmore and Lila Corwin-Berman have pointed to the importance of the urban environment as both a context for and a product of Jewish activity. The American in American Jewish history is rethought here. Studies make specific cases for what that means. Whether the American is deemed largely inconsequential, the real frame is either the large-scale global or the more granular urban experience, or whether the American is a matter of specific economic or state formations. Rather than asking whether and to what extent Jews assimilated, Americanized, or created hybrid identities, this work asks what geographic, legal, and economic frames have been significant for American Jewish life and identity, and how have Jews not only reacted to these forces, but also helped to create them. Especially important for my project on the Institute for Southern Jewish Life is Lila Corwin-Berman's ongoing current study of what she calls the American Jewish philanthropic complex. This work promises to explore how Jewish philanthropists gained power and privilege in the second half of the 20th century, thanks to the state and the particularities of its tax codes, which Jews played a role in writing. God bless Lila, she's reading tax codes in the name of American Jewish history. Reading the Institute through her work highlights its vigorous fundraising routines, its establishment of endowments, which Berman notes have come to be associated very strongly with narratives of continuity, and the Institute's tax-exempt status as a 501c nonprofit, which she argues amounts to a subsidy from the state by exempting them from taxes. It also calls attention to the Institute's finances and to its broader relationship to non-Jewish power brokers, especially in the state of Mississippi, where the Institute has been widely embraced. Politicians and Institute staff members have sort of attended each other's events, and staff members from the Institute have been hired by major statewide institutions following their time at the Institute. So that's sort of how some of the historical scholarship has informed this project. But in undertaking it, I've also looked outside of historical circles to methodologies in other fields, especially in anthropology and religious studies, which are also sites of interesting work in American Jewish studies. In folklore, anthropology, and cultural studies, scholars like Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimlet, Jonathan Boyarin, and Jeffrey Chandler have asked critical questions about Jewish culture, public display, and the relationship between Jews and modernity more generally. In my own field of religious studies, work on the history of rabbis and of the synagogue have paved the way for a recent bumper crop of scholarship seeking to understand Judaism in America in new ways. I would include my own first book, which is coming out in December in this category, alongside scholarship by colleagues like Sarah Imhoff and Shaul Magid. Our work demonstrates how Jews have, on the one hand, related to the category of religion, which doesn't seem to fit quite right, given the Protestant assumptions that underlie it, right, that religion is private and individual and about belief. On the other hand, we explore how ordinary American Jews have forged religious pathways outside of synagogues and other denominational contexts. And this is where a lot of the work in my own book is about sort of the religious experience of Jews on the road and in small towns and outside of institutional settings, and how the institutions that were created in the 19th century were actually intended to deal with the chaos wrought by these mobile Jews. So what work in these fields of religious studies and anthropology bring to the table is an emphasis on the uncertainty and fluidity of identity and categorization. Where maybe the histories are rethinking what we mean by America, here it is concepts like Judaism, Jewish culture, and Jews that are not taken as stable givens, but rather are interrogated and investigated in order to see how they are deployed, by whom, and to what ends. The question is less what have Jews done in the past and what about it has been significant, and more how have Jews understood themselves and been understood by others to be Jews in the first place. One of the primary inspirations for this project is a recent anthropology dissertation by Joshua Friedman on the contemporary Yiddish revival, especially on the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. Friedman draws on a tradition of ethnographic research on the American Jewish community, dating at least to Barbara Meyerhoff's groundbreaking Number Our Days, which if you haven't read recently, return to it. There's also a wonderful 30-minute documentary that won an Academy Award in 1978 about a Jewish old age home, or not an old age home, a senior center in Venice Beach. It's amazing. So Friedman's study is the outcome of 2 years of ethnographic research, and he outlines the contested narratives and ironic relationships to the Yiddish language that have been cultivated by the nonprofit Book Center. He talks about how the books themselves come to be what is valued even more than the content of the books or the Yiddish language itself. A second inspiration from among my peers is Rachel Gross, who trained in religious studies at Princeton. Her dissertation focuses on the material culture of American Jewish nostalgia and the emotional and religious work that it does. Heritage projects like synagogue museums, she shows, aim to cultivate emotion, which becomes a measure of authenticity and even a form of religious meaning for American Jews beyond denominational labels, that going to a synagogue museum becomes a sort of Jewish religious experience, maybe more so than attending Shabbat morning services. So these projects from my friends and colleagues are not only about the Yiddish revival or Jewish nostalgia as means of Jewish memory and identity, rather they center on important questions of structure, means, and narrative. They ask what makes these cultural projects possible, and how does that shape how they construct their mission and purpose? What is included in such stories, and what is left out? How do individuals engage with them in surprising and unauthorized ways? Ethnicity, religion, and history in these studies are not real facts that exist to be uncovered in the record, but rather are narratives that are performed and used by American Jews. The documents in these projects are not only texts, but material objects, participant observation, and interviews. The Institute and the museum are also philanthropic endeavors engaged with material objects, and like the subjects of Friedman's and Gross's research, they too are using these media to further cultural work of rescue and remembrance, albeit in a regional key and context. So as I begin on this new project, these questions and methods will be undergirding my work, helping me to explore how the museum and the Institute understand and promote the Southern Jewish experience, and what the stakes, politics, and religious resonances of that project are. Their work will help me think, among other topics, about the Shalom Y'all onesies that the Institute sells in the peddler's cart section of its website and newsletter, for the Southern Jewish baby, I guess. The colorful maps that its staff create to demonstrate the geographical breadth and productivity of their work. The Institute's popularity among American Jews outside of the South, who nonetheless feel connected to its work, and its various and to date largely unsuccessful plans to turn small-town synagogues into museums that will attract tourists to economically depressed downtown districts. Although there have been recent moves now to sort of pull it all together in New Orleans. They've got a group that's trying to make the museum happen there. So trained in religious studies, a historian of the 19th century, but now embarking on this contemporary project, I suppose I can call myself a practitioner of American Jewish studies as much as anything else. And I'm not alone. The recent rise in American Jewish studies jobs that I began with reflects an increasing disciplinary diversity among those who study American Jews, although it is important to note that there are politics to these approaches, academic and otherwise. Within American Jewish studies, my sense is that historical approaches continue to be seen as more serious than others, even as scholars fight marginalization within their larger disciplinary contexts. Anthropology has been slow to embrace work on American Jews because they are perceived as Western elites, not exotic others. In my own experience, religious studies is open to the study of American Jews, at least in theory, because of the recognition of Judaism as a world religion. And yet, in practice, this embrace is still partial and sometimes awkward. David Hollinger, former president of the Organization of American Historians, has made powerful arguments for the inclusion of Jews in American history, and yet it can still be hard to convince U.S. historians that 0.2% of the population, who enjoy considerable power and privilege to boot, deserve any of their attention. The new critical tenor and multidisciplinary approach of those who study American Jews may help turn this tide, however, and in any event, I think it's significant for the future of our field, however we describe it. As a recent special issue of Jewish Social Studies indicates, the studies of American Jews in the Trump era seems potentially to be a different beast. Sorry, did say the T word, but it feels a million miles away, but I think it's what's happening now. It's the state of our field. American Jewish historians can point to earlier moments in order to contextualize troubling forms of power and discrimination in the present, but how do we deploy this power responsibly? Are there, as Lila Corwin-Berman noted in her contribution to that issue, certain critiques, important critiques of liberalism, for instance, that no longer seem ethical to make, given the far more foreboding political forces afoot? In any event, will anyone outside of the Guild ever listen? And for those of us within it, how else might our narratives about the past and present and the questions that we ask of them start to change? There are many challenges and questions ahead, but my sense is that those of us who study American Jews should contribute to these discussions. We will be best prepared to do this by bringing our multiple disciplinary approaches into conversation, both within our larger field and with each other. Our historical rigor has served us well, but disciplines like religious studies and anthropology, as well as others engaged in the study of American Jews, most notably in the fields of literature and sociology, can teach us how to ask new critical questions and also how to engage with what is happening in the contemporary moment. Whether or not this is what the job committees or donors expect from those that they hire in American Jewish studies, these are skills that undoubtedly all American Jewish historians, as well as our students, readers, and other constituencies are going to need in the years to come. Thank you. Yes?
I'm Margie Meyer. I'm a rabbi who served in some of these small town southern congregations. And I think it's fascinating to study from a historical point of view the Israel. A couple of things, Shari, in your work. It really came out of, and I think Barry will agree with this, the camp movement. And the young people who were in a regional southern regional camp as young people who formed a regional identity that perhaps their parents hadn't had. And Macy was one of them, but he helped develop that in the camp in Mississippi. So that was a strong start, and I think you have to look there. The other thing I wanted to mention is the other end, and I think it worth your while to, and I'm sure you're planning to do this, to interview some of these small town congregations who are working with the Institute in terms of, because this has a plan
to work with these dying congregations so that they will take their stuff afterwards, etc. And it's almost like being in a hospice situation. Some of these congregations have developed a love-hate relationship because they know they're not going to last, but they don't like the idea of preparing, but they know that they should. So I think that some of that is very important to look into as you look into the ISGL.
Yeah, the museum was on the campus of the Reform camp in Utica, Mississippi until just a couple years ago when the camp kind of booted them off. But it is interesting that when these small towns had Judaica objects to part with, the first place that they thought, I don't know if it was the first place, maybe they thought to bring it to the AJA, maybe not, but where they thought, where can I bring these things, they thought to the camp and to the Southern Regional Camp in particular. And I'm really interested in the dying communities and the tensions that emerge, right? Because in the literature of the ISJL, it comes off as very smooth, and we're here to help them, but of course these are difficult situations. And I got interested in this project because, in large part because of how similar it seemed to the Yiddish Book Center, and to the similarities, this thing is dying, but like, is it dying? We want to preserve it, but we want to restore it, and kind of the tensions that emerge in those projects that in some ways conflict. Yeah, sure.
Irish Eskin. I did a study of Camp Blue Star about 1994. It's on JewishDataBank.org. And as far as congregations going out of business, are you familiar with the Jewish Legacy Project? It's an organization. The former head of the Atlanta Federation is in charge of it. And when a congregation realizes that everyone is over 80 and they've got some limited time left, they help them set up some trust and some ways in which the material can get passed to another congregation.
Yeah, and so the South is where a lot of this is happening, and the ISJL is interested in the South, but one of the other tensions is that, of course, there are dying congregations throughout the United States, and so you'll see that they're sticking to their 13-state region in the South, but of course, there's communities in Idaho where the same thing is happening. So, why this sort of insistence on the significance and importance of the Southern Jewish identity is something that's really interesting to me. Okay. Sure.
Thank you, Shari. Thank you. Is anybody outside of the Guild going to listen? And if anybody is, one venue for that is surely public history, which we often don't think enough about. And so this will be a great way to round off our presentation today, because Annie Polland is going to speak to us on Pilgrimage to a Tenement, American Jewish History for Popular Audiences. Annie is the Executive Vice President for Programs and Interpretation at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum in New York, where she oversees exhibits and education. She's leading a team that is creating a project called Under One Roof, an exhibit featuring 3 families, including Holocaust refugees, Puerto Rican migrants, and Chinese immigrants. And this will debut in the fall of this year and blends old-fashioned storytelling with technology. Her book with Daniel Sawyer, titled The Emerging Metropolis, New York Jews in the Age of Immigration, 1840 to 1920, won the National Jewish Book Award for Jewish Book of the Year. She received her PhD in history from Columbia University and has served as Vice President of Education at the museum at Eldred Street, and where she wrote Landmark of the Spirit, which was published in 2008. Annie, if you please.
Thank you so much. As I set up the PowerPoint, one of the things I was thinking about at the beginning when we were thinking about center and periphery was when I first arrived at Columbia in 1996 in the fall, after working in the banana fields here. I met with Arya Gorin, who I was lucky enough to kind of overlap with his last years at Columbia, and he told me, he doesn't give advice, he's an anarchist, he doesn't like to give advice, but the advice he was going to give me was that I would find in Jewish history at Columbia that there was a kind of hierarchy, and basically the farther east you go, the more important you are. Hence the United States, not so important. And that was confirmed in some of the first Jewish history seminar I took I was lucky to take with Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, and at the end of it he said, "Are you sure you want to study American Jewish history?" And I was sure. And not only did I took that periphery and I made it even more, I made myself even more marginal and peripheral by becoming, by working in the public and thinking about how to translate history to a public audience. And I haven't yet opened my PowerPoint, but I will do so. So I just thought that was an interesting place to begin. I am not objective about what I'm going to talk about today, so I'm excited to be able to talk about it with you and through conversation hopefully become more objective. But has anyone been to the Lower East Side Tenement Museum? Okay, good, excellent. Okay, so just a little bit of background. One of the things that's important to note in thinking about that public is that each year the Tenement Museum welcomes over 244,000 people, and we would be able to welcome more if we had more space. So this is the tenement where the museum began in the 1980s, 1988. It was founded by a woman named Ruth Abram and another collaborator, Anita Jacobson, in 1988. And they were basically looking for a space in order to tell immigration history. Ellis Island was great, but everyone knows that the history of immigrants, the real immigration struggle in many ways becomes once you get to where you're going and how do you adapt. And they realized that this building, and thinking about the tenements, which were really the homes for so many different immigrants, and certainly the home for the Jewish immigrants who were arriving, was an incredible place to be able to tell that story. And they were very clear at the beginning that they didn't want it to be a Jewish museum. So there's this interesting situation now where the Tenement Museum is not a Jewish museum, technically, yet it tells American Jewish history to a broader and more diverse public than many other institutions. Just in terms of comparison, I think the National Museum of American Jewish History has about 121,000 people each year, which is a big number. But when you think about this space, I think the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia, and you saw a picture of that earlier, has 25,000 square feet for exhibit space. And the Tenement Museum, anyone want to guess how much square footage we have? We have about probably less than 7,000 square feet of exhibit space. So when you think about the number of 244,000 getting through 7,000 square feet each year, it's a considerable number of people who are learning about American Jewish history, albeit not in a Jewish history museum. I should also clarify, though, that some of our tours do not really touch on Jewish history at all. Our Irish Outsiders tour doesn't, although the theme of discrimination, it comes up in discussions with visitors. But all the other tours have at least one Jewish family that's part of the program. So just in terms also of perspective, and comparing to other museums, the Jewish Museum, I believe, has about 200,000 visitors, and the Museum of Jewish Heritage, also New York, has about 150,000. So this 244,000, which we hope will be more once our new exhibit opens, is significant. And what do we make of the fact that it's in a museum that's not technically a Jewish museum? What does that mean? Does it mean anything? So I wanted to explore that question, talk a little bit about how we tell those histories, how we've done it in this building, and how we'll be doing it in our new building. Just to explain the shift and the kind of the opening of this new building, this was founded in 1988. It opened for tours in about 1994, and slowly over time more tours were added to different floors of the building. And the founders of the museum made important choices in the beginning to kind of echo this idea that they didn't want it to be just a Jewish museum. So most historic sites you go to tend to focus on about a decade's worth, maybe 2 decades worth of interpretation. And this museum does much broader, about 70 years, from the time of the building opened in 1863 to the time it closed to residents in 1935. They did that on purpose, because if they had chosen just one moment of significance, let's say they chose 1900, everyone who lived in the building was East European Jewish, or the children of East European Jewish immigrants, spoke Yiddish, etc. It would have been a Jewish museum if they picked 1900. But by going from 1863 to 1935, they were able to get a couple Irish families in the very beginning. They were able to get Italian families at the end. And in the middle, you have the kind of 2 major waves, German immigration, primarily non-Jewish German immigration, then becoming more German Jewish, and then East European Jewish, and then also Sephardic. So that interpretation ended in 1935 because the residents had to leave the building because there was a new building code that required the landlord to update the building. And so it was the middle of the Depression. Also, immigration restriction laws had set in, meaning that there were much fewer people coming through, and therefore there was not even the impetus to do that update. So therefore, he closed the building and we ended our interpretation many years later. This building just down the block, which is where we have our museum store, this museum was purchased in 2007 by the museum in order to continue the story, because this building stayed open past that 1934 law as a result of a lot of different kind of architectural changes. But if you can see here in this corner, it's the old Hebrew publishing building. It's now an oyster bar. But it was first built as the Bank of the U.S. by a man named Joseph Marcus, and it was one of the first bank to go out of business in December, I think, of 1930. So there's another story there. We don't have time to talk about that. But the updates that were done to this building in order to accommodate that space made it a unique building and allowed it to withstand that 1935 immigration law. Okay, so now the exciting part of this is that in looking at the residents who lived in this building, we were able to further diversify the stories that we told. So of course we know that immigration and migration to the Lower East Side does not end with 1935, and it really doesn't even end with 1924. And so we have, in 1940s, Holocaust survivors arriving that lived in this building. We have many Puerto Ricans moving to the building, and towards the 1960s, we have many Chinese immigrants living in the building as well. And in terms of our interpretation, what we do is we restore the apartments to tell the stories of people who really lived in the buildings. So this is the home of Natalia Gumpertz, who lived here. This is in the 1870 census. She was living with her husband, Julius, who was a shoemaker, and her 2 children. Within a few years, they'd have 2 more children. The Panic of 1873 sets in, and Julius takes off. Many years later, we don't think that Natalie ever found out what happened to him, but he was found in Cincinnati living in a Jewish old aged home. But as far as she knew, she had no idea what happened to him. She was helped, and this is a picture of Natalie. She was helped in the beginning by other German immigrants who lived in the building, notably Lucas Glockner, the landlord, John Schneider, who ran the saloon, who went to go look for Julius and didn't find them. We know this because many years later, when Julius Gumpertz's father died and left an inheritance, Natalie had the impetus to go make sure and declare him dead so that she could claim this inheritance, and those 2 men served as her backup and supported her claim that he had disappeared. At the same time, though, we know that she was helped by the Jewish community. And these are records from the United Hebrew Charity, and we found her listed here. We actually found them listed here before he took off. So even before she was deserted, the family had need for assistance. And there's many, many different things to be said about what you find here. Who's worthy of help? Who is not worthy of help? How much are they helped? And different people who are examining this have different definitions of whether someone's worthy or not, which is in its own is a fascinating subject. But this is just one example in the old building how we're able to take a family story and connect it to larger issues in Jewish life, and such as the importance of the United Hebrew Charities. Another example is the Rokossovsky Apartment. This is set to the 19-teens, and this is Fanny Rokossovsky's Sabbath table. And here we talk about how Jewish religious customs sometimes clash with the economic imperatives of the Lower East Side in America. So clearly people are coming over to work, they're coming here to support their family. What happens when support of the family forces someone to question whether they're going to work on the Sabbath or not? And so this is a question that's explored here. We know that Abraham Rokossovsky, the father, refused to work. However, what we also know is that he was unemployed for many many, many months because of that decision. So who goes out to work? The teenage children. And we're not certain whether they worked on the Sabbath, but what we do know is that many teenage children in the first decade of the 20th century would work on Saturdays, and this is a result of the garment industry shifting. But here we're able to explore that. And this is a picture of the Rokossovsky family. Some of them are not in the picture, probably because they are at work. And these are some of the documents that we use to explore this issue. This is a techina about Sabbath, in which it was printed in a 1916 volume that the Hebrew Publishing Company put out, that basically says, I ask you, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that you should guard and shelter me, my husband, and my children from Sabbath and holiday desecration. Send us to our livelihood in pleasure and not in sorrow, and we shall by no means, due to livelihood, not be able to keep the Sabbath and the holidays. So we are able to pass this document out to visitors who can then explore this tension and the way in which the economic tension has made it into the religious liturgy. We also have, because this family had children working in the garment industry at the same time as the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, we reproduced the cover of the Vorwärts March 26th, the day after the fire, in which you can see, der Morgue ist voll mit unserer Carbonis. The morgue is full with our sacrifices, our victims. And what's interesting when we explore this is we're able to talk about how the Rokossovskys, even though they did not lose their own daughters, they still had to fear if they would go to work the next day that they might lose them, and also the kind of sense of community they had on the Lower East Side where they felt that these were our victims. But we're also able to point out the way in which the city more broadly felt that these were their victims as well, because it was in the years following the fire that protective legislation was put forward and much more labor legislation, because New Yorkers felt that they were their victims as well, so much that Tammany would even change its ways and become reform to an extent. So in the next exhibit, we're able to explore and put Jewish history in the context of other histories by looking at these three families that lived in the building. Some of them overlapped, some of them would not overlap, but all of them overlapped with other people from different places. The Lower East Side by 1960 would actually become one of the most diverse neighborhoods in New York City, which means in the world. This is very quickly just a breakdown of 1960, and you can see that by that point, Puerto Ricans are 26% of the population, African Americans 7%, the other is mostly Chinese, that's 4%, and white is too misleading of a category, because if you can break down that to really Jewish and Italian, and mostly the children of Jews and Italians. And then just to jump ahead, you can even see how this speeds up with the passage of the 1965 immigration law, and you can see the huge jump in numbers of Chinese immigrants who are now able to make it to the area. And this area that we're looking at doesn't even include Chinatown proper. So you're seeing how the Lower East Side is becoming extremely diverse. Now the families that we're looking at, I can guarantee you that none of them had that pie chart on the refrigerator that they were studying. And what we do on the tour is we ask our visitors to consider, what does diversity mean in a day-to-day situation? How do people experience diversity? So this is Bella Epstein on the bottom. This is her from just a few years ago. Above is her, she's the elder of the sisters, standing outside their apartment on the corner of Orchard and Delancey Street. Bless you. The Bella's family, you can see Jose being interviewed in Puerto Rico. This is him as a boy in the apartment in the 1960s. And finally, the Wong family, who arrives in 1968 and moves into the building. And this is Yap Ping today, and this is her as a young girl in Hong Kong. So we're telling all of these stories in one exhibit, and we're interested in both the particularities of each story, but also the ways in which diversity affected their own upbringing. So as Bella is growing up, what did it mean to be growing up on the Lower East Side? So we explore that by looking at her encounter with the building. This is actually a picture of the apartment building before we recreated it, and she was able to come back and see the mezuzah on the door. It's really nice not to have to explain what a mezuzah is. And what she said when she saw that mezuzah, she said, "This is it. This is my apartment." She remembered looking through the keyhole to see that her mother always told her she had to look before she opened the door. And she said that this mezuzah was the one her parents put up. And she said it was brave of them to have done so because they had been persecuted for being Jewish. And yet, she added, in the United States, they felt comfortable too. They understood that this was a place where different religions could live side by side. This is now the same, you can see the doorway kind of in the back, the arch, and this is recreated. And we recreate it, in this case, a lot from Bella's memories, but also we do a kind of physical analysis of the building, look at paint patterns. For example, Bella said her mother used Freilich colors to paint. She used happy, joyful colors. In part, Bella was saying because she wanted to create this happy life for her children. And so we were able to uncover these Freilich colors. They didn't look so Freilich under layers and layers of other paint, but we were able to find it, match it, and then reproduce it with the right Benjamin Moore colors. This cabinet, if you open, I wish I had a picture of it open, we have in there the dresses that she remembered, and you can see a telephone, and she tells a great story of not behaving at Beis Yaakov, the yeshiva she went to, and the rabbi calling to talk about how poorly she had misbehaved, and she knew that that call was coming, so she covered it over with towels and blankets and got away with it, except then the next day he came to the door and knocked on the door. And this is the living room. And then this is a picture that's hanging in the apartment, but that we'll zoom in on. Her parents, Kalman and Rivka Epstein. Kalman was born in Kieltz in 1903. Rivka was born in Lodz, or near Lodz, in 1920. So one of the things Bella says that her mother always says is they would never have been married had it not been for the war, because he had lost a family, she had lost a family. And they met at a displaced persons camp in Zielsheim. And one of the things I learned through this work is that the rates of birth and marriage were higher in these displaced persons camp than anywhere else in the world between 1945 and 1947. So this marriage happened. It happened quickly. We explain on the tour to our visitors that you have about 250,000 to 300,000 Jews in these camps who want to get to the United States and they want to get to Palestine and what would become Israel, but they can't because of a political situation. And we're able to delve more closely into the United States situation and talk about the sentiment in the United States. A Gallup poll in December of 1945 found that only 5% of Americans thought it wise to change those immigration quotas that had been on the books since 1924, and that if they were to let people in, like the number one place was Scandinavia, and then I think Holland and Belgium, so that the political climate wasn't ripe yet to change those laws. When they wanted to come, but President Truman passed an executive order also in December of 1945 that used the quotas within the quota system, expedited the passage of visas to those in the displaced persons camps who wanted to get in. 37,000 people came, I think, through that. And then in 1948, Congress would pass the Displaced Persons and Refugee Act. All of this might be familiar to you, but none of it is familiar to the visitors that we've been testing this out on in focus groups. And so they're able to come in and when we bring it up, and we talk about this executive order that Truman passed, of course, the conversation often turns to other executive orders that other presidents whose last names start with T have passed, which becomes a very rich and provocative conversation. So Kalman and Rivka are able to come in part, and this is a picture, they came on the Marine Perch. This is not the Marine Perch, or not the boat that they came on, but there's amazing footage, and it's on our website, so you can see it, of a group of refugees arriving in New York and being greeted by relatives. It's unbelievable. This is their declaration of intention to become citizens when they arrive. And they're able to come because, in part, they're sponsored by Kalman's uncle, Jacob, and Golda, his aunt, who sponsored them, but then also helped them adjust to the Lower East Side at the time. He runs a dress store, and Kalman eventually would end up working for him and taking over the store. So one of the things that courses through all three stories in this new exhibit is that they are connected to the garment industry, and everyone works in the garment industry. This is Bella and her sister. What Bella tells us is that most of what I've just told you in terms of their past, in terms of the displaced persons camps, in terms of the camps before that, he had been in Auschwitz, and she, Theresienstadt, is that they didn't talk about it at home. Certainly there were many refugee families who did talk about it, but this was a home in which it was not talked about. And Bella talks about her bedroom, kind of, and we use this to kind of represent her growing up on the Lower East Side, and her connections, just what it was like for her as a child. And when Bella walked in, she went straight to this window, which overlooks an air shaft, and she called out Rosetta. Rosetta de Benedetto was her best friend who lived across the air shaft, and most of our visitors don't need to be told that Rosetta de Benedetto is not a Jewish name. It's an Italian Catholic name, and she was her best friend growing up in the building. And so we're able to talk about these connections she has. She also has a friend, Barbara, who's African-American, who she meets at the playground when her mom takes her to the playground. And so Bella grows up in this home that's filled with Yiddish, but yet her playmates, the ones she's making in the neighborhood, represent the different groups that are coming through and are part of her childhood. Just as Linda Siegel, who she meets at Beis Yaakov, she thinks of as someone a little bit different from her family, because Linda Siegel is an American Jew, and the way that she distinguished American Jews from the refugees is that they didn't speak with accents. So you see also the diversity within one group that we're able to pull out. In terms of Rosetta, then we're able to also see how commonplace diversity, which would be the academic term for this, coined by Suzanne Wessendorf, that commonplace diversity has its borders. It's not just about people becoming friends, it's also about understanding where you don't cross over. And one of the things that is clear with all these families is whereas the children are much more comfortable going into each other's apartments and forming real friendships, the parents stay within their apartments more, and the conversations are restricted to hallways. A lot of this is common sense, but it's interesting to kind of tease this out. And so with Rosetta, Bella remembers the smell of spaghetti sauce all the time, but she never tasted the spaghetti sauce because it had pork in it. She also remembers, perhaps more seriously, a time when Rosetta said to her, "Your parents weren't invited to the party. Do you know why your parents weren't invited to the party?" And Bella said, "No." And she said, "Because they're Jewish." And Bella said, "Oh, okay." And many years later kind of realized what that meant. So these stories exist, and they show these but that didn't stop her from being friends with Rosetta at the same time. Now, one of the things that we're able to do, too, to show the impact of America on Bella, and I don't know if it will work here because I'm not sure about sound, is she received a record player. Her father brought home a record player in 1958, and let me see if it will work. If not, I know the recording by heart, so I can do it.
Father bought a record player that he used to play Yossel Rosenblatt albums on. Yossel Rosenblatt was a famous cantor, and he would say, "Oh, a stimme, that means a voice, and I'd say, "Okay, fine." And then when my father wasn't using the record player, I had gotten my mother to buy me a record, and it was called like, "Oh, Please Stay By Me, Diana." I'm so young and you're so old. This, my darling, I've been told. That was the song. It was played more in my house than I think anywhere else in the world. That was what made me an American.
I don't want to interrupt Paul Anka. No, I'm glad that played because I can't sing as good as Paul Anka can. But I think the point, and this is a good point to end on, is that she said that album made her an American. She was born in 1948 on the Lower East Side. She was an American, but it was the music that made her feel American. And when we've brought that up to different groups, I remember a woman from New Jersey who was about in her 20s, the daughter of immigrants from India, talked about how that was the same situation for her as well, that it was American pop culture that she was able to bring in the house that kind of infused her American identity or strengthened an American identity. There's much more to say about these families. This is just a city directory that shows this building, and you see after the 1965 law, how diverse it becomes, and will, in addition to telling Bella's story, tell the story of the Saez. I think Francisco Saez is down here, and then Hu Hong Mo, who came under the Paper Sun name but changed it to Wang when he arrived. This is Bella and her family today, and that's her son, Jacob, who looks very much like Coleman when you compare the pictures. Her 3 granddaughters, and Bella says she looks exactly like Leon. And then this is the Epsteins, but also the Wangs and the Saezes, whose story I wasn't able to tell today, but just to give you a sense of how, when we tell Jewish history at the Tenement Museum, part of it is thinking about it in a comparative lens. And what I would argue is that this comparative lens strengthens the nuances and the kind of elements of identity that make it both more resonant for our visitors, but I think are also instructive for those academics who are studying the lives of these people and these communities. It's always a challenge to be connecting particular family stories to broader context, to be weaving in primary sources, and to be doing this for people from a variety of different backgrounds, but it's extremely exciting as well. And one last thing is that Leon, one of the things we were able to do is that we were able to bring a genealogist and research Coleman's own history back that Bella didn't know about. So we were able to go to the late 1700s, which is pretty good. And so Bella found out this, we were able to film her finding it out, and then Bella explaining it to her grandchildren, and she said, look, now we have so many more names we can be using. Now we know these names, we could be using this. And Leon said, I'm going to grow up and I'm going to have twins, and I'm going to name them Coleman and Rivka after our grandparents, which is very nice. So I'll end with that.
Well, we may have time for one question if there is. Well, yes, please.
So I was wondering, I remember when I was an intern at the Tenement Museum with you almost 10 years ago, it seemed certain tours were more popular than others, slightly. I was wondering if you see that your visitors often match the profile of the people in the tenements, and how you think this new tenement is going to change.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, the most popular tour is the Hard Times tour, which is German and Italian. And then I would say Sweatshop Workers, which is 2 East European Jewish families. I would also say that many people do arrive and say, I want the Irish tour, I want the Jewish tour. But I think because we know that once they're on the tour, we're able to so even on the Jewish tour, there are comparisons to Chinese immigration. And I think this will really shake everything up, because you can't, no matter what you're choosing, you're really thinking about the connections. But it's an excellent question, because I think, and it's one that Jack Kugelmass wrote a really interesting article at the early years of the Tenement Museum, pitting this in conflict, basically saying the founders of this museum are a little crazy because they might have their own ideology, but they're pushing it onto this building that many of the visitors see as a pilgrimage to their own Jewish heritage and identity. But it hasn't been, although that was a wise observation, an interesting observation, it hasn't borne fruit in the sense that even as the museum has added more and more exhibits that diverge from Jewish history, the audiences grow. So thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Well, I think we want to thank our speakers today. And may I say to all those who want to study American Jewish history from Israel, you should think about having a fellowship to the American Jewish Archives.
Surprise, surprise.